One letter. 5 days. One deadline written not by a government or a court, but by tradition itself, and set against the will of the man sitting on the chair of Peter. On the eve of the Feast of Saints, Peter and Paul, in a small office inside the Apostolic Palace, a pope picked up a pen and wrote 9 paragraphs that could determine whether a piece of the Catholic Church breaks away entirely or turns back at the very last hour. Somewhere in Switzerland, a superior general read those words and had to decide whether 5 decades of slow-burning defiance would end in reconciliation, or in an act canon law calls automatic excommunication. This is the story of Pope Leo XIV's final warning, the deadline at midnight and the choice still hanging in the balance. To understand why a single date on a calendar could fracture a church of 1.5 billion people, the story has to begin nearly 60 years earlier, in the smoke and confusion that followed the Second Vatican Council. In the mid-1960s, the world's bishops gathered in Rome and opened the windows of the church to modernity. New relationships with other faiths, a mass said in local languages instead of only Latin, a fresh emphasis on religious liberty and dialogue with the modern world. For many Catholics, it was a long overdue renewal, a church finally speaking a language the 20th century could understand. For others, it felt like watching the walls of a fortress being pulled down, stone by stone, exposing everything inside to a wind it was never built to withstand. Among those who felt the ground shift beneath them was a French archbishop named Marcel Lefebvre, a missionary bishop who had spent much of his life in colonial Africa and who returned to a Europe he no longer recognised. He believed the council's reforms, however well-intentioned, had opened the door to confusion, to a slow erosion of doctrine, and to a liturgy stripped of its sacred weight. In 1970, he founded a seminary in the small Swiss village of Écon, and with it, the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X, a society built to preserve the old rites, the old catechism, the old certainties, in defiance of what its founder saw as a church drifting from itself. For nearly 2 decades, Lefebvre's fraternity existed in an uneasy limbo, tolerated, watched, occasionally negotiated with, never fully embraced and never formally cast out. Popes Paul VI and John Paul II both tried, in different ways, to bring the wandering flock back inside the fold. There were meetings in Rome, drafts of agreements, moments when reconciliation seemed close enough to touch. But in 1988, the uneasy peace broke. Lefebvre, convinced Rome was stalling and that the traditionalist cause could not survive without a bishop of its own, consecrated 4 priests as bishops without the mandate of the Pope. It was an act canon law treats with brutal simplicity, a bishop who ordains another bishop without papal permission, and the men who receive that ordination knowing it is unauthorized, incur automatic excommunication. No trial required, no formal decree needed, the penalty triggers itself in the moment the rite is completed. John Paul II declared the excommunications a fact days later, in a document that still shapes every conversation about the fraternity's status to this day. A movement built to save tradition had, in defending it, torn itself away from the very authority tradition depends on. That wound never fully closed. Benedict XVI, a pope with deep personal sympathy for the old liturgy, lifted the excommunications in 2009 in a gesture of extraordinary and, at the time, deeply controversial mercy, hoping full reconciliation would follow close behind. It didn't. Doctrinal disagreements over religious liberty, ecumenism, and the authority of the council itself kept the fraternity in a strange, canonical shadow zone, recognised enough that the faithful could licitly receive sacraments from its priests, yet never formally reunited with Rome as a structure within the universal church. Francis, for his part, extended pastoral concessions even as tensions simmered beneath the surface, allowing fraternity priests to hear confessions validly, and in later years, even authorising marriages celebrated in their chapels to be recognised. Each of these gestures was in its own way a small bridge built across a canyon that refused to close. And now, in the summer of 2026, less than 2 months into the pontificate of a newly elected pope, that 38-year-old wound has been ripped open again. Because in early 2026, word spread from the fraternity's headquarters in Switzerland that history was about to repeat itself. The Society of St. Pius X announced its intention to consecrate new bishops of its own, again without a mandate from Rome, and it fixed a date for the ceremony, July 1st. The choice of date was not incidental. It fell deliberately in the window around the feast that celebrates the 2 pillars of the Church, Peter and Paul, a date thick with symbolism for an act that would, once again, sever a piece of the flock from the shepherd, whose authority that very feast exists to honour. In February, Cardinal Fernandez, the Vatican's doctrinal chief, met personally with the fraternity's superior general, Father David Pagliarani, in an attempt to head off the crisis before it could calcify into ritual and irreversible consequence. It was, by all accounts, a cordial meeting. Pagliarani listened. He did not walk away hostile, but the meeting did not change the outcome. The society reaffirmed its intention to proceed. And so, for months, the countdown ran quietly in the background of a papacy, still finding its footing, a new pope who had spent his first year travelling to Africa, dedicating a tower of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, ordaining priests, laying his hands on new archbishops at the very feast now shadowed by looming rupture, all while a second, harder test waited for him at the calendar's edge, growing closer with every general audience, every Angelus, every ordinary Wednesday that brought July one day nearer. It would be easy to tell this story as a chess match of canon law and Vatican diplomacy, all cardinals and communiques and carefully worded press statements. But underneath the legal language is something far more human. Parishes. Small parishes in provincial towns across France and Argentina and the American Midwest, where families who love the old Latin Mass have built their entire spiritual lives around the priests the fraternity ordains. Sacraments those families depend on. Marriages blessed there. Children baptized there, taught their first prayers in Latin before they could read them in their own language. If the consecrations go ahead and the excommunications trigger automatically, the fraternity's priests do not vanish, and its masses do not stop, but its bishops, and by extension the men they go on to ordain in the years ahead, step into a canonical no-man's land, licit standing, thrown into deeper doubt, the sacramental safety net families relied on pulled thinner still. That is the quiet stake behind the headline. Not abstract church politics playing out in Rome, but real families, in real pews, wondering, on the eve of a date circled in red on the fraternity's calendar, whether the priest they trust, the man who baptized their children, will still stand on solid ground with the universal church tomorrow morning. It is worth slowing down here, because this is where the story turns from history into something happening in real time. This week, under this pope. On the 29th of June, the Solemnity of Saints. Peter and Paul itself, the very feast whose symbolism the fraternity had chosen to shadow, Pope Leo XIV sat down and wrote directly to Father Pagliarani. Not a decree, not a canonical warning issued through an intermediary dicastery, filtered through layers of Vatican bureaucracy. A letter addressed personally and released in full to the public in the last hours before the deadline it hoped to prevent. He opened not with threats but with acknowledgement, recognising the sincere devotion to liturgical life, the seriousness of priestly formation, the real zeal for fidelity to tradition that lives inside the fraternity's communities, the same patient, generous posture his predecessors had shown toward them for decades. He named their strengths before he named his concerns, a small but deliberate choice, the choice of a man who wanted to be heard as a father before he was heard as a judge. And then, in a single line that reads less like the language of institutional authority, and more like a father's plea to a child standing at the edge of a decision that cannot be undone, he wrote, with Christian affection and from the heart, asking them simply to turn back. That is the phrase the whole crisis now turns on. Please turn back. 4 words, stripped of legal Latin, stripped of ceremony, that carry more weight than any tribunal ruling could. The Pope went on to lay out, plainly, what was actually at risk, not abstract doctrine, but the spiritual good of ordinary believers, because the schismatic act being planned would deprive them of the licit, and in some cases, even the valid, reception of the sacraments they love and depend on for their sanctification. This was not, in his framing, a jurisdictional squabble between Rome and a breakaway society. It was a warning about the people in the pews, the grandmothers who go to confession every Saturday, the young couples preparing for marriage in front of an altar rail rather than a modern sanctuary, the children waiting to make their first communion, all of them standing unknowingly in the blast radius of a decision made far above their heads, in a language of canons and precedents most of them will never read. The letter did not stop at warning. It reached for something older and sadder, the image the Church has used for 2,000 years to describe what schism actually costs. Christ's garment, the Gospel tells us, was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom, so precious that the soldiers at the foot of the cross refused to tear it and cast lots for it instead, unwilling to destroy something whole even in the middle of an execution. To rend that garment now, the Pope wrote, is a sin of extreme gravity, not because unity is a matter of institutional tidiness or Vatican optics, but because the wholeness of the Church is meant to mirror the wholeness of Christ himself, body and seam and thread. He said he prayed for them. He said his heart was heavy and yet still hopeful, two feelings most people would assume couldn't coexist in the same sentence, let alone the same man. And then, invoking the full weight of the authority he holds not for himself, but as a trust from Christ, he asked them, formally, finally, to desist, to step back from the ordination, to let the deadline pass unmarked, quietly, the way so many other tense dates in church history had passed once cooler counsel prevailed. He closed by entrusting the whole fragile situation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Mother of Good Counsel, an appeal, in the end, not to law but to conscience, the one court no canon lawyer can rule inside of. And then he waited. That is the part almost no headline captures, because it is the least dramatic and the most human. A pope who had done everything within his power, who had written the most personal letter of his young pontificate, who now had nothing left to do but wait for an answer that was not his to give. There is no clause in canon law that lets a pope reach across a border and stop a consecration by force. There is no committee that can override a superior general's decision inside his own society. All Leo XIV had in the end was a letter, a signature, and a prayer. The same tools every one of his predecessors had reached for in moments just like this one, going back centuries, long before there were dicasteries or press offices or public statements released to wire services within hours of being written. Somewhere in Menzingen, Switzerland, in the modest headquarters the fraternity has occupied since its founding, Father Pagliarani held that letter in his hands. The man who received it is not a caricature of a rebel, not the villain a simplified telling of this story might want him to be. He has spent decades inside the world Lefebvre built, ordained within it, formed by its seminaries, shaped by its conviction that fidelity to the old rites is not stubbornness but survival, not defiance but rescue. He met with Cardinal Fernandez in February. He listened, by every account respectfully, and still, by the fraternity's own public statements, the intention to proceed had not changed. Not out of malice toward the Pope personally, not out of contempt for the man himself, but out of a decades-deep belief, inherited from Lefebvre and carried forward through every superior general since, that the fraternity cannot wait any longer for a Rome it fears will never fully restore what it believes was lost after the council. It is worth pausing on why bishops matter so much to a society that already has priests, seminaries, chapels, even its own schools scattered across 5 continents. The answer is almost mathematically simple and almost unbearably sad. Priests can only be ordained by bishops. Father Pagliarani leads a fraternity with more than 600 priests worldwide and rising vocations filling its seminaries in Econ, in the United States, in Argentina, but it currently depends on a shrinking handful of aging bishops, the last of the 4 consecrated in that fateful 1988 ceremony, to keep ordaining the next generation of men who fill those pews. Without new bishops of its own, the fraternity's future thins with every year that passes, every retirement, every quiet funeral of a man who once stood beside Lefebvre himself. That is the engine driving the urgency. Not theology alone, but actuarial reality, the cold arithmetic of mortality pressing against a community that measures its survival not in decades, but in the remaining years of a handful of elderly men. That is the anxiety underneath the defiance, the fear that if they wait for Rome's permission one more time, there may be no bishops left to ordain anyone at all. And here is where the story holds its second, deeper tension, the one beneath the canon law and the countdown clock. Because this is not simply a fight between an institution and a breakaway group. It is a fight between 2 kinds of love for the same thing. The fraternity's priests and the seminarians filling their chapels do not see themselves as rebels against the Church. They see themselves as its most faithful remnant, guarding what they believe the rest of the Church let slip away in the rush toward modernity. And Pope Leo XIV, in the very same weeks he was drafting that letter, was standing in front of another audience entirely, defending the Second Vatican Council's reforms, not as a rupture with the past, but as a legitimate unfolding of it, reminding the faithful, in a general audience just weeks before, that tradition, as Benedict XVI once described it, is like a river carrying its source within itself even as it moves forward, never abandoning where it came from, even as it flows somewhere new. 2 different images of loyalty to the same 2,000-year-old church. One side sees Rome as the river that has drifted from its source. The other sees the fraternity as a tributary that has cut itself off from the current entirely, choosing stillness over the risk of being carried somewhere unrecognisable. Both, in their own telling, believe they are the ones protecting what matters most, and both would be genuinely wounded to hear themselves described as the villain of this story. That tension is not new to this pope alone. It has, in different forms, shadowed every pontiff since the council closed its doors in 1965. But what makes this moment different, what makes it worth stopping the calendar on, is the timing. A pope barely a year into office, still learning the rhythms of a job that ages men visibly within months, is being asked to make a decision about schism before he has even finished his first Christmas, his first Easter, his first full liturgical year in the role. Predecessors who wrestled with the fraternity, John Paul II in 1988, Benedict in 2009, did so after years in the chair of Peter, with the accumulated authority and familiarity that time in office tends to grant. Leo XIV does not have that luxury. He inherited this deadline the way a new homeowner inherits a leaking roof from the previous tenant, not of his own making, but undeniably, urgently his to fix. It's worth holding on to one more image before the countdown resumes, because it says more than any canon or any consecration ever could. Picture a seminarian in Acorn, 22 years old, 3 weeks from ordination, who has spent 6 years training under a system built entirely around the promise that a fraternity bishop will one day lay hands on him and send him out to say the old mass in some small parish that has been waiting years for a priest of its own. He did not choose the year 1988. He was not alive for Lefebvre's decision, for John Paul II's declaration, for Benedict's mercy, 2 decades later. He inherited a wound he had no part in opening. And now, in the final days of June 2026, he is watching to see whether the man who is meant to ordain him will do so standing fully inside communion with Rome, or standing just outside it one more time, the way it was done before. That is the real weight of a date on a calendar. Not doctrine in the abstract, but one young man's ordination day, and whether the hands laid on his head will carry with them the full blessing of the universal church, or carry instead the same unresolved fracture his teachers were ordained into 38 years earlier, a fracture he would then carry, unasked for, into every mass he says for the rest of his priesthood. It's worth slowing down again here, because this is the moment the whole story has been building toward. Not a battle of wills between two proud institutions, but a pope who chose, in the final hours before a deadline he could not control, to lead not with condemnation, but with what the letter itself called a paternal heart. He did not send a canonical ultimatum through a Vatican dicastery, stamped and filed and forwarded through the usual channels. He wrote it himself, in the first person, on the feast of the 2 apostles, whose martyrdom built the church he now leads, and he used the word please. There is something almost startling about that, for anyone used to thinking of papal authority in terms of decrees and tribunals, red seals and formal Latin pronouncements. A pope at the height of his office, choosing the register of a father pleading with a son to come home before the door locks for good, not because he lacked the authority to command, but because he seemed to understand that commands had already been tried, for 38 years, and had not been enough. So, where does that leave things as the deadline itself arrives? As of this telling, on the very date the fraternity fixed nearly 6 months ago, the answer sits exactly where the Pope's letter left it. Unresolved, suspended between a private conscience in Switzerland and a public wound that has never fully healed. If the consecrations proceed as planned, the same automatic penalty that fell in 1988 falls again, not because Rome wishes to punish, but because canon law treats the act itself as self-excommunicating, a line crossed rather than a sentence handed down by any tribunal. The fraternity's priests would remain priests, its masses would continue, its chapels would still open their doors on Sunday morning. But the fragile, decades-long project of reconciliation, the meetings, the concessions, the mercy Benedict XVI extended at such cost to his own credibility among reform-minded Catholics, the small bridges Francis quietly built one pastoral exception at a time, would absorb a wound that could take another generation to even begin closing. A new cohort of fraternity bishops, ordained outside communion, would become the new elderly men. A future pope one day writes a similar letter to, 60 years from now, on some other anniversary of some other feast. If instead the fraternity chooses to turn back, if Father Pagliarani decides that the Pope's plea outweighs 38 years of accumulated grievance, it would mark something almost without precedent in the fraternity's history. Not a decree from Rome, but a personal letter, answered not with law but with the very thing that letter asked for, a change of heart. It would not resolve the deeper doctrinal disagreements overnight. The questions about religious liberty, about ecumenism, about how far the Council's reforms should be trusted, would remain exactly where they were the day before. But it would mean something in itself had shifted. That 56 years after Acorn was founded, 38 years after the last rupture, a fraternity that has always measured its identity by what it refuses to compromise, chose, this once, to answer a plea rather than repeat a pattern. And that alone, whatever else remains unsettled, would be its own kind of history. And that is, in the end, the single quotable truth this whole story keeps circling back to, the line worth carrying away from everything that has happened this week. A schism is never really caused by a date, or a ceremony, or even by centuries of theological disagreement, stacked on top of each other like sediment. It is caused, every single time, by two sides who stop believing the other one is still listening. And it is healed the same way, not by canon law, not by tribunals, not by force, but by one side choosing, even now, even this late, to write a letter instead of a decree, and by the other side choosing, even now, even this late, to read it as an act of love rather than an act of control. Whatever the fraternity decides at midnight, Pope Leo XIV has already answered the only question that was ever fully his to answer, not whether tradition and reform can be reconciled in a single afternoon, but whether the seamless garment of Christ is still worth begging, one more time, not to be torn. If this story moved something in you, there's more of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate unfolding week by week. Subscribe to stay with it and leave a comment with the moment in this story that struck you most.